Pack your things, Margaret. You have no legal standing here anymore. My daughter-in-law said at the reading of my husband's will, her voice calm, almost bored, as if she were asking me to clear a plate from the table instead of leave the home I had shared with her father-in-law for 43 years. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I simply folded my hands in my lap and nodded, because in that moment I understood something she did not. Grief has a way of sharpening the mind. The conference room at Harrington and Blake smelled faintly of leather and burnt coffee. Robert's framed photo sat beside me on the polished mahogany table, the same gentle smile he wore the day we bought our first house back in 1982. He had built his construction company from nothing more than a pickup truck and a borrowed $5,000 loan, and I had stood beside him through every 70-hour workweek, every delayed paycheck, every risk. Now I sat alone, dressed in black, listening as attorney Blake Harrington cleared his throat and explained, in precise legal language, that most of Robert's assets had been placed into a revised estate structure finalized 6 months before his sudden heart attack. 6 months. I kept my eyes on the grain of the table. Vanessa sat across from me in a tailored cream suit, her hands folded neatly over a leather portfolio. She did not look at me when Mr. Harrington explained that the primary authority over certain decisions now rested with my son Daniel, as acting trustee. Daniel shifted in his chair, his jaw tight, avoiding my gaze. The boy who once ran to me with scraped knees and science fair ribbons now studied his cufflinks as if they were more interesting than his widowed mother. Given the outstanding liabilities and the restructuring, Mr. Harrington continued, it may be advisable for Mrs. Collins to consider alternative housing arrangements. Alternative housing. The words hung in the air like frost. I had hosted every Christmas in that house. I had measured Daniel's height on the pantry doorframe. I had planted the oak tree in the backyard the year Robert turned 50. And now it was being discussed as if I were a temporary tenant. Vanessa finally looked at me then. Her expression was not cruel. That would have required emotion. It was efficient. It's just practical, Margaret, she said softly. The property taxes alone are nearly $14,000 a year. Maintenance, insurance. It's a lot for one person. One person. I almost smiled at the phrase. For decades, I had been the one person who balanced the books, who negotiated with contractors, who kept payroll steady when projects ran late. I had signed documents beside Robert at kitchen tables and in bank offices, my name appearing on more papers than Vanessa would ever know. We can arrange movers within 2 weeks, she added. It's better to handle this quickly. 2 weeks to pack 43 years into cardboard boxes. I nodded again. Of course, I said, my voice steady, surprising even me. The meeting ended with polite handshakes. Daniel murmured something about calling me later. Vanessa was already discussing timelines with Mr. Harrington as if I were no longer in the room. I walked out of the building into the crisp October air, the wind catching the edge of my coat. The parking lot stretched wide and ordinary under a pale sky. I sat in my sedan for a long moment, hands resting on the steering wheel Robert had replaced just last spring. They thought I would panic. They thought grief would make me careless. They thought that because I had stood quietly at that table, I was weak. The next morning, instead of sorting through closets or calling realtors, I drove downtown to an office they had not mentioned, to a name they had likely forgotten, and as I stepped inside, I realized something steady and clear. They had prepared their version of my future without asking me, but they had underestimated one simple fact. I had been married to Robert Collins for over 4 decades. I knew exactly how he planned for storms. I had not stepped inside Caldwell and Pierce in nearly 10 years. Yet the receptionist recognized my last name the moment I signed the ledger. Robert had insisted on keeping old relationships alive, especially the ones built before success changed the size of our office and the number of zeros on our contracts. The waiting room was modest compared to the polished glass tower where Vanessa preferred to hold meetings, but it felt steady, grounded, like the foundation of a house poured correctly the first time. I sat with my handbag on my lap and listened to the ticking of a brass clock mounted on the wall. Each second felt deliberate, measured. When Mr. Thomas Caldwell entered the room, he looked older than I remembered, his hair completely silver now, but his handshake was firm. Margaret, he said quietly, and in that single word I heard recognition, not dismissal. Inside his office, I placed the estate summary I had been given onto his desk. I did not dramatize what had happened. I simply described the meeting, the revised structure, the suggestion that I relocate within 14 days. He listened without interrupting, his eyes scanning the paperwork line by line. The silence stretched, but it was not uncomfortable. It was analytical. Finally, he leaned back in his chair. "Did Robert ever mention a secondary trust?" he asked. The question landed softly, but carried weight. I remembered a late evening nearly a year ago, Robert sitting at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad, reviewing numbers after dinner. He had looked up at me and said, "If anything ever happens to me, you will not have to ask anyone for permission." At the time, I thought he was speaking from love, not strategy. He said something like that. I replied carefully. Mr. Caldwell nodded once and opened a drawer in his credenza. He removed a thin file labeled with our last name in block letters. My pulse did not race. It slowed. "Robert came in 8 months ago," he said. "He wanted to establish a protective provision. He was concerned about influence. He did not need to say Vanessa's name. The word influence was precise enough." He turned the file toward me. Inside was documentation of a marital trust layered beneath the visible estate structure, one that transferred controlling interest of the company's remaining shares and the house deed directly to me upon his death, provided certain conditions were met. One condition stood out in careful legal language. Any attempt to remove me from primary residence or to restrict my access to joint assets without my written consent would trigger an automatic review of all beneficiary distributions. I read the sentence twice. The room felt very still. "Why was this not presented yesterday?" I asked. Mr. Caldwell adjusted his glasses. "Because it is not filed within the public summary. It is activated upon challenge." Challenge. The word echoed in my mind. Vanessa had not simply suggested I move. She had applied pressure. She had formalized it. And in doing so, she may have set something in motion that she did not anticipate. I folded my hands on the desk, just as I had in the other conference room. But this time the gesture meant something different. "What happens next?" I asked. Mr. Caldwell closed the file gently. "We do nothing immediately," he said. "We allow them to proceed. If they attempt formal eviction or asset restriction, we respond." There was no urgency in his tone. No panic. Only sequence. I left his office with a copy of the trust summary secured inside my handbag. The autumn sun was higher now, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. Traffic moved as it always had. People hurried with coffee cups and briefcases, unaware that my life had quietly shifted direction in less than 24 hours. When I pulled into my driveway, the house looked the same as it had for decades. White shutters, trimmed hedges, the oak tree stretching strong in the backyard. Inside, Daniel and Vanessa were seated at the kitchen island, papers spread neatly across the granite countertop. Vanessa looked up first. "We were just discussing timelines," she said smoothly. I placed my handbag on the chair and removed my gloves one finger at a time. "Of course," I replied evenly. I did not mention Caldwell. I did not mention the file. I simply took a seat at the table I had chosen 43 years ago and waited for them to continue, knowing that sometimes the most powerful move is allowing others to believe they are in control. Vanessa spread the papers across my kitchen island as if she were arranging place settings for a dinner party, neat stacks aligned with the edge of the granite, a yellow highlighter placed carefully beside them. Daniel stood behind her, his shoulders slightly hunched, scrolling through something on his phone before placing it face down when I entered. "We spoke with Harrington again," Vanessa began, her tone light, almost helpful. "It would be easier for everyone if we transfer the utilities into our names immediately. It streamlines the estate." Streamlines. That word again. Everything with her was about efficiency. I removed my coat slowly and hung it in the closet by the mudroom, the same closet where Daniel used to toss his Little League jacket after practice. I returned to the island and took a seat without responding. Vanessa slid a document toward me. "This authorizes access to the joint operating account for temporary management," she explained. "Just until everything settles." I glanced at the heading. It was not temporary management. It was full discretionary authority. I did not point that out. Instead, I folded my reading glasses open and scanned the paragraphs carefully, the way Robert had taught me years ago when vendors tried to bury unfavorable clauses in small print. Daniel cleared his throat. "Mom, it is just paperwork," he said, still not meeting my eyes. Just paperwork. That was what they had called it the first time I was asked to sign something without explanation, 2 days after the funeral, when I was still answering condolence messages and returning casseroles. I placed the document back on the counter. "I will review this," I said evenly. Vanessa's smile tightened for a fraction of a second before returning to its polished shape. "Of course," she replied. "But we really should move quickly. The company has pending contracts. Payroll next Friday is almost $78,000. She said the number as if I had never written those checks myself. I nodded. "I am aware," I answered calmly. That afternoon, I logged into the online banking portal from the desktop computer in Robert's study. The password had been changed. I tried again, carefully. Still denied. A small notification indicated that administrative access was now restricted to the acting trustee, Daniel. I leaned back in Robert's leather chair and looked at the framed blueprint on the wall from his first commercial build. The ink had faded slightly over the years, but the lines were still clear. Foundations, load-bearing beams, exits marked in red. Every structure requires reinforcement at its weakest point. I picked up my phone and dialed the bank directly. After verifying my identity, I requested a complete transaction history for the past 6 months to be printed and prepared for in-person collection. The representative hesitated, then agreed. When I hung up, I did not feel anger. I felt confirmation. That evening at dinner, Vanessa spoke about downsizing as if it were a natural next step. "There are beautiful senior communities about 20 miles north," she said, passing Daniel the salt. "Maintenance-free living. Activities. It could be refreshing." I buttered a piece of bread and listened. "I am not ready to relocate," I replied quietly. Daniel sighed. "Mom, we are just thinking long-term." Long-term. I looked at him across the table, at the familiar slope of his shoulders, and realized how thoroughly he had been convinced that decisiveness equaled competence. "So am I," I said. After they went upstairs, I returned to Robert's study and opened the bottom drawer of his filing cabinet. Inside were folders organized by year, labeled in his careful handwriting. I ran my fingers along the tabs until I reached the most recent one. If Vanessa believed she could move pieces across the board without resistance, she was mistaken. I did not need to confront her yet. I needed clarity. And clarity begins with records, signatures, and dates. I switched on the desk lamp and began reading. I read until well past midnight, the desk lamp casting a narrow circle of light across Robert's handwriting. Contracts stacked in careful order the way he always kept them. Outside, the oak tree brushed softly against the window with each gust of autumn wind, a steady reminder that seasons change whether we approve of them or not. The transaction history I had requested from the bank was ready by 9 the next morning. I drove there without mentioning it to Daniel or Vanessa. The teller recognized me and offered quiet condolences before sliding a thick envelope across the counter. The paper felt heavier than it should have. Back in my car, I opened it and began reviewing the statements line by line. Large transfers had been initiated 3 months before Robert passed, moved from the operating reserve into a newly structured management account. The authorization code listed Daniel as trustee. The timing was precise. 3 months ago was when Robert had spent 2 afternoons away from the office claiming he needed to meet with an insurance broker. I remembered because he had returned home thoughtful, quieter than usual, and had stood at the kitchen sink looking out at the yard for a long time before joining me at the table. "If something ever shifts under your feet," he had said then, not looking directly at me, "do not react immediately. Look at the foundation first." At the time I assumed he was speaking about business risks. Now I understood he had been speaking about people. When I returned home, Vanessa was in the living room measuring the wall space with a tape measure, making notes on a tablet. "I was thinking we could stage the house properly before listing it," she said without preamble. Neutral tones sell faster. I set my purse down on the entry table. "The house is not listed," I replied. She smiled lightly. "It will be. We just need to be proactive." Proactive. She favored words that implied inevitability. Daniel emerged from the hallway holding a folder. "Mom, Harrington is drafting the formal transition paperwork," he said. "We need your signature by Friday." Friday was 4 days away. I studied his face, searching for hesitation. There was some, but it was buried beneath resolve. "I will not sign anything by Friday," I said evenly. Silence settled across the room. Vanessa lowered the tape measure slowly. "That would complicate things," she answered. "For everyone." I walked past her into the kitchen and placed the bank statements on the counter. Then we should all be very certain about what we are doing, I said. I did not accuse. I did not raise my voice. I simply opened the envelope and turned the pages so Daniel could see the transfer dates. His eyes flickered across the numbers. Those were operational adjustments, he said quickly. Dad approved them. Perhaps, I replied. Then there should be documentation reflecting that approval. Vanessa stepped closer, her posture still composed. Margaret, this tone is unnecessary. We are trying to protect the company. Protect. Another word carefully chosen. I closed the folder and met her gaze steadily. So am I said. That evening I returned to Robert's filing cabinet and found what I had hoped would be there. A signed memo from him addressed to Thomas Caldwell, referencing the establishment of a contingency trust and expressing concern about external influence on corporate governance. The phrase was underlined in blue ink. External influence. He had seen it coming. He had prepared quietly, methodically, without confrontation. I sat back in his chair and allowed the realization to settle fully. Vanessa believed speed would corner me. Daniel believed authority would silence me. But neither of them understood the most important thing about Robert Collins. He did not build anything without a safeguard. And he had never left me unprotected. On Thursday morning, a certified letter arrived addressed to me in precise black print, and I knew before opening it that Vanessa had decided to accelerate her timeline. I set the envelope on the kitchen table and poured myself a cup of coffee first, allowing the steam to rise between us like a quiet curtain. Daniel watched from across the room, pretending to scroll through emails on his laptop, but his eyes flicked toward the envelope every few seconds. When I finally slid a letter opener beneath the flap, the paper inside confirmed what I expected, a formal notice outlining a proposed transfer of primary residence authority to the acting trustee, citing financial efficiency and estate consolidation. It was written in polite legal language, but the message was clear. They were no longer suggesting that I relocate. They were formalizing it. I read every line slowly, then folded the document once and placed it back inside the envelope. Is this necessary? I asked without looking up. Vanessa stepped forward, her tone controlled. It protects everyone involved, she replied. If the property becomes part of the corporate holding structure, it shields it from unnecessary tax exposure. I had balanced enough year-end statements to recognize when tax language was being used as leverage. The property is already shielded, I said evenly. Daniel shifted in his seat. Mom, we cannot keep delaying decisions. The company has liabilities. We have to think strategically. I met his eyes fully for the first time in days. I am thinking strategically, I answered. The silence that followed was different from previous ones. It was no longer filled with assumption. It carried resistance. That afternoon, I drove to Caldwell and Pierce again, the certified letter resting on the passenger seat beside me. Mr. Caldwell read it without interruption, his expression unchanged. When he finished, he placed it neatly on his desk and opened the thin file containing Robert's contingency trust. They have initiated what the document defines as a structural displacement attempt, he said calmly. The phrase sounded clinical, almost detached. Which means? I asked. Which means, he replied, tapping a paragraph with his pen, that the protective provision can be activated. I felt no surge of triumph, only steadiness. What does activation require? A formal response from our office, asserting your rights under the marital trust and requesting full disclosure of all corporate transfers within the past 6 months. 6 months. The exact period reflected in the bank statements I had reviewed. I nodded once. Prepare it, I said. When I returned home that evening, Vanessa was seated at the dining table reviewing staging brochures. Soft gray palettes. Minimalist decor. She looked up as I entered. We should schedule the photographer next week, she began. I placed my handbag on the chair and removed a single sheet of paper from it. There will be no photographer, I said quietly. Daniel looked between us. What are you talking about? He asked. I set the letter from Caldwell and Pierce on the table. Vanessa picked it up, her expression composed as she scanned the header. Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly when she reached the second paragraph. Daniel leaned over her shoulder. What is this? He demanded. I folded my hands in front of me. The same gesture I had used at the first meeting, but now it carried weight. It is a response, I said, and a request for full financial disclosure. The room grew still. The oak tree outside brushed softly against the window, steady as ever. Vanessa lowered the page slowly. This is unnecessary escalation, she said. On the contrary, I replied. It is clarification. Daniel's face flushed, not with anger, but with realization. For the first time since Robert's funeral, the assumption that I would quietly comply had fractured. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse. I simply stood there, calm and certain, knowing that Robert had anticipated this exact moment and had left me not just protected, but prepared. The house felt different the next morning, not tense, but alert, as if the walls themselves understood that the balance of power had shifted. Vanessa did not mention the letter again, but I noticed she had cleared the staging brochures from the dining table. Daniel left earlier than usual for the office, his coffee untouched on the counter. By noon, my phone rang. The caller identification displayed Harrington and Blake. I let it ring twice before answering. Mrs. Collins. Attorney Harrington began, his voice measured. We received correspondence from Caldwell and Pierce. I believe there may be a misunderstanding regarding the estate structure. I sat in Robert's study, sunlight cutting across the floor in long stripes. There is no misunderstanding, I replied calmly. There is a request for transparency. He paused briefly. The activation of the marital trust provision is a significant step, he continued. It introduces review mechanisms that could delay corporate operations. I glanced at the framed memo Robert had, written months earlier. Then it would be wise to comply quickly, I said. Silence followed. He shifted his tone. We are prepared to provide documentation, of course. However, this adversarial posture could create unnecessary strain within the family. Family. The word sounded different now. Strain, I repeated softly, begins when clarity is withheld. I ended the call without raising my voice. That afternoon, Daniel returned home earlier than expected. He stood in the doorway of the study, hesitant. Mom, do you understand what this is going to do? He asked. I closed the ledger I had been reviewing and looked at him steadily. It will reveal the truth, I said. He ran a hand through his hair, the same nervous gesture he had as a teenager before exams. Vanessa says this could freeze distributions for months. The company cannot function like that. The company functioned for 4 decades under careful planning, I replied. If it cannot withstand a review, then the problem is not the review. He exhaled sharply. You are making this harder than it needs to be. I rose from the chair slowly. No, I answered. I am making it precise. That evening, a courier delivered a thick binder containing preliminary financial disclosures. Transfers, restructuring agreements, internal memos. I carried it to the dining table and began turning pages one by one. The numbers confirmed what instinct had already told me. Funds had been reallocated not for operational necessity, but to consolidate decision-making authority under Daniel's trusteeship, reducing my formal influence before Robert's passing. It was subtle, legal, strategically timed, but it was there. Vanessa appeared in the doorway, arms folded loosely. You could still step back, she said quietly. This does not have to escalate. I met her gaze without hostility. It already did, I replied. The moment you asked me to leave my own home. She held my eyes for several seconds, then turned away. Later that night, as I organized the binder into chronological order, my phone vibrated with a brief message from Caldwell. Formal review hearing scheduled for next Tuesday at 10 in the morning. I read the message twice and set the phone down. Outside, the oak tree stood firm against a steady wind. Inside, the air felt clearer than it had in weeks. They had believed speed would overwhelm me. They had believed grief would cloud my judgment. Instead, each document, each signature, each carefully chosen word was building something far stronger than confrontation. It was building position. And position, once established, does not require noise to hold its ground. Tuesday arrived with a pale gray sky and air that carried the sharp edge of early winter, and I dressed carefully, not in morning black this time, but in a navy suit Robert had once said made me look unshakable. I drove myself downtown, parking in the same garage where I had met him for lunch countless times during the early years of his company. The review hearing was not held in a courtroom, but in a formal conference chamber reserved for estate arbitration, long polished table, flags in the corner, a digital recorder placed at the center to document every word. When I entered, Vanessa was already seated beside Attorney Harrington, her posture straight, her expression composed but tighter than usual. Daniel stood when he saw me, then hesitated before sitting again. Thomas Caldwell greeted me with a brief nod and gestured toward the chair at his right. I took my seat without speaking. The proceeding began with procedural statements, each attorney outlining the purpose of the review. Harrington emphasized operational continuity and fiduciary responsibility. Caldwell referenced protective provisions and beneficiary rights. I listened, hands folded calmly on the table. When the financial disclosures were projected onto the screen, the room grew noticeably quieter. Line by line, the transfers appeared, dates aligned precisely with internal memoranda recommending structural consolidation. Caldwell requested clarification regarding the justification for reclassifying residential property under corporate holding status prior to Robert's passing. Harrington responded that it was a strategic precaution advised during estate planning discussions. With whom were those discussions conducted? Caldwell asked evenly. Harrington glanced at Daniel. Primarily with Mr. Collins as acting successor. The distinction was subtle but significant. Acting successor, not co-owner. Caldwell then produced Robert's memo referencing concern about external influence on governance decisions. The phrase appeared enlarged on the screen. I watched Vanessa's fingers tighten slightly around her pen. Daniel shifted in his chair. Did Mr. Collins express reservations regarding pressure to expedite restructuring? Caldwell continued. Daniel hesitated. He wanted everything organized, he said finally. He believed clarity prevented conflict. I almost smiled at that. Clarity. The very thing I had requested. The review chairperson, an older woman with steady eyes, leaned forward. Was Mrs. Collins consulted regarding these reallocations? She asked. Silence followed. Not dramatic. Not explosive. Just heavy. No, Daniel admitted quietly. The admission did not sound malicious. It sounded unprepared. Vanessa spoke then, her tone controlled. The intention was to protect long-term stability. There was no attempt to marginalize anyone. Caldwell did not challenge her directly. Instead, he referenced the specific clause within the marital trust triggered by attempts to displace primary residence or restrict asset access without written consent. The clause was read aloud in full. The words echoed softly in the chamber. Automatic review. Suspension of discretionary distributions pending resolution. Restoration of co-equal authority upon substantiated challenge. The chairperson requested a brief recess to examine the documentation. During the pause, no one spoke. I looked at the oak tree visible through the high window across the hall, its branches steady against the wind. When the session resumed, the chairperson's voice was calm. Based on the documentation provided, the activation of the marital trust provision is valid, she stated. Effective immediately, decision-making authority regarding residential property and corporate share distributions will revert to shared oversight between Mrs. Collins and the acting trustee, pending full reconciliation. The words were procedural, but their meaning was unmistakable. Shared oversight. Revert. Vanessa's expression did not collapse. It hardened. Daniel exhaled slowly, as if something he had been holding finally settled. I did not react outwardly. I simply nodded once. The balance had shifted not through accusation or anger, but through sequence and documentation. As we gathered our papers, Vanessa looked at me across the table. There was no apology in her eyes, only recalculation. That was fine. I was no longer reacting. I was positioned. When we stepped out of the arbitration building, the air felt colder than it had that morning, but clearer. Daniel walked a few paces ahead of us toward the parking garage, his shoulders no longer hunched, yet not fully relaxed either. Vanessa remained beside Attorney Harrington, speaking in low, controlled tones. I did not try to overhear. I did not need to. The ruling had already shifted the ground beneath all of us. Shared oversight was not a victory speech. It was leverage. That afternoon, I returned to the house and moved through each room slowly, not to reclaim it, but to reassess it. The living room still held the faint scent of the lilies sent after Robert's funeral. The staging. Brochures were gone entirely. In their place, the coffee table was bare. I stood at the window and looked out at the oak tree, its branches steady against the wind. This house had never been a symbol of power to me. It had been stability. And stability, once tested, reveals its true structure. By early evening, Daniel called a family meeting in the kitchen. He stood at the island, hands pressed flat against the granite. Vanessa remained seated, posture composed but quiet. We need to adjust, Daniel began. The ruling changes how decisions are made. His voice carried less authority than before, more caution. I took my usual seat at the table. Yes, I said simply. Vanessa folded her hands. The review will continue for several weeks, she stated. During that time, operational decisions must be co-signed. I nodded once. Then we will co-sign them. The words sounded deliberate. Daniel looked at me carefully. Mom, what do you want? He asked. It was the first direct question he had asked me since this began. I considered it for a moment. Transparency, I replied. In respect for the structure your father established. Vanessa's eyes flickered briefly. No one intended disrespect, she said evenly. I met her gaze without hostility. Intent does not override outcome, I answered. Silence settled across the room, not hostile, but recalibrated. Later that night, Daniel knocked softly on the study door. He stepped inside without waiting for an answer, something he had not done since he was a teenager. Did Dad really think we would push you out? He asked quietly. I closed the ledger I had been reviewing. Your father believed in contingency planning, I said. He prepared for possibilities, not accusations. Daniel looked down at the floor. Vanessa thought restructuring early would prevent confusion later, he admitted. She said decisive action shows strength. I studied my son's face, the familiar lines shaped by years I had watched unfold. Strength without consultation can look like control, I replied gently. He nodded slowly, absorbing the distinction. The next morning, revised documents arrived reflecting the arbitration outcome. My name was restored to primary authorization on the residential deed. Corporate distributions required dual approval. The language was formal, precise. I signed where appropriate, not hurriedly, but deliberately, and returned the documents through Caldwell's office. Vanessa observed the process without commentary. She had not conceded defeat. She had adjusted strategy. I recognized that expression. It was the same one Robert wore during negotiations when the other party underestimated him. That afternoon, I requested a full board review of upcoming contracts, citing the need for alignment under shared oversight. Daniel agreed. Vanessa did not object. The momentum had shifted from reaction to governance. No one mentioned moving trucks. No one mentioned listing the property. Instead, we discussed timelines, vendor agreements, tax projections. Ordinary language. Structured language. The kind that builds rather than displaces. As evening settled, I walked through the hallway and paused outside the master bedroom. Robert's photograph rested on the dresser, his steady gaze unchanged. You planned carefully, I murmured under my breath. And for the first time since the funeral, the house did not feel like it was being measured for departure. It felt anchored again, not because the conflict had vanished, but because the foundation had been tested and held. The weeks that followed did not explode into confrontation. They settled into structure. Shared oversight meant every major decision passed across the same dining table where I had once been asked to consider senior communities and moving boxes. Now the conversations were documented, agendas printed, numbers reviewed in detail. Payroll was processed on schedule. Vendor contracts were renegotiated with measured caution. The company did not collapse under scrutiny. It stabilized. During the extended review, additional disclosures confirmed that while the restructuring had been strategically timed, no irreversible damage had been done. Funds remained intact. Assets were traceable. The attempt had not been theft. It had been consolidation without consent. There is a difference. One evening, nearly a month after the arbitration hearing, we gathered again in the kitchen. The oak tree outside had shed most of its leaves, branches bare but strong. Daniel stood at the counter with a revised governance proposal in his hands. Vanessa sat beside him, composed but quieter than before. We have reviewed the trust language in full, Daniel said carefully. It is clear Dad intended equal authority if any displacement occurred. He looked at me directly this time. I should have consulted you from the beginning. The apology was not dramatic. It was simple. I inclined my head once. Consultation prevents escalation, I replied. Vanessa placed a folder on the table and slid it toward me. This outlines a permanent co-chair structure, she said. Major asset decisions require dual approval. Residential property remains solely under your name unless voluntarily transferred. Her voice did not waver. It carried professionalism, not warmth, but also not dismissal. I opened the folder and read each clause slowly. The language was precise, balanced. No hidden acceleration. No indirect displacement. When I finished, I closed it and rested my hands lightly on top. This aligns with the trust, I said. Daniel exhaled softly, as if he had been holding tension for weeks. The next morning, the final review findings were filed. The marital trust remained active but no longer under dispute. Corporate governance was amended. My access to every account, every document, every meeting was restored without restriction. There would be no forced sale, no relocation timeline, no quiet removal of my signature from ledgers I had balanced for decades. Later that afternoon, I walked alone through the backyard, the grass cool beneath my shoes. The oak tree stood tall, stripped of leaves, yet unwavering. Robert had planted it the year he turned 50, telling Daniel that strong roots matter more than fast growth. I placed my hand against its trunk and allowed myself a small, private breath. Vanessa joined me at the edge of the patio after a moment. She did not step too close. I underestimated you, she said evenly. There was no bitterness in her tone, only acknowledgement. I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not a villain, but someone who equated speed with security. You underestimated the foundation, I replied calmly. She nodded once. Inside the house, Daniel was reviewing next quarter projections at the kitchen island. Life had not returned to what it was before. It had adjusted. Authority had been clarified. Boundaries had been drawn. I did not need to reclaim the house through anger or triumph. I simply continued living in it, signing documents deliberately, attending meetings prepared, occupying the space I had always earned. They had believed I would fade quietly after the funeral, that grief would soften my resolve and urgency would corner me into compliance. Instead, documentation spoke. Preparation held. And the structure Robert built, both in business and in marriage, did exactly what it was designed to do. It protected the one person he had promised would never have to ask for permission.